Kartik Krishna and I are here for the Florida Squeeze. Many of you know who listen to this channel or read our site or follow our Twitter at FLA Squeeze, that's our Twitter handle, that we've been sort of skeptical here at the Florida Squeeze about this Republicans for Harris movement. We've seen time and again a conversation that Republicans would cross over and vote against Donald Trump. And it just hasn't happened here in the state of Florida in the past. And nationally, the crossover vote, even in 2020, was somewhat limited. So we've been skeptical, and so much of what we do is a data-driven approach. But there are vibes, there are feels, there are things going on the ground that you don't get tangible data or numbers to quantify until after the fact. And there is growing evidence that there is going to be a larger percentage, at least here in Florida, of Republicans who vote for Harris than Democrats who vote for Donald Trump. I, in fact, had said just a few days ago that I thought the crossover vote would be roughly equal in Florida and maybe equal nationally. There are Democrats voting for Donald Trump, believe it or not. Those of you who are partisan Democrats may not believe it, but there are. I actually know a few. So here's what we're observing. Here's what we're seeing. Historically in Florida, there has not been, since the 1990s, large numbers of Republicans vote for a Democratic candidate, with one exception. The 2006 U.S. Senate election, where Bill Nelson, per the modeling after the election, probably pulled about 20% of the GOP vote against Katherine Harris, who was the GOP nominee for U.S. Senate. And remember, that was a wave year. That was a wave election year. But that was the only time we've seen it. Even in 2012, when Nelson won by 13 points, what happened is the Republicans, by and large, stuck with the Republican nominee, Connie Mack IV, Connie Mack Jr., and Junior, if you want to look at it that way. NPA voters swung more heavily toward Nelson than they did towards President Obama on the same day as he was winning re-election, and he did win Florida, but by a reduced margin from Bill Nelson. The Republican number was under 10% for Nelson. So we don't have a recent history with this. The recent history we have is with votes going the other way. Democrats voting for Republican nominees for various offices. Republicans getting double digits in terms of percentages from Democrats for offices in the Florida cabinet, for chief financial officer, for agriculture commissioner, for at times, well, I'm not quite sure if it's happened in an attorney general's race, but it's happened in those other two races multiple times. So many of us in Florida who have been involved in Democratic politics, who have been political consultants at times, I was a political consultant for many years, are very gun-shy about the idea that lots of Republicans will cross over and vote for any Democratic candidate. It just doesn't happen. And I've always been dubious about endorsements. We talked about the number of prominent Florida Republicans that have endorsed Kamala Harris, right? Former CFO Bob Milligan. He's one of those statewide officials who I said got double-digit Democratic votes to cross over. Former Attorney General and Secretary of State Jim Smith. Longtime State Senator Paula Dockery. Former State Senator Nancy Argenziano, among others, right? Many Republicans in Florida who have been prominent in the past have endorsed Harris for president. So I'm always of the belief that those votes don't transfer. That doesn't really matter. But what I'm finding now on the ground, talking to people, the anecdotal evidence we're seeing, and even some of the modeling, Christopher Bouzy, who's got a very good track record as a data guy, says he has a model and data that shows 13% of Republicans in Florida are voting for Harris. If that's the case, the race is very competitive in Florida. I mean, I was doing math yesterday, which I showed on one of our videos. If you transfer that 13% over and say maybe only 2 or 3% of Democrats vote for Trump, so there's a 10% gap there, and then you assign the NPAs on the ratio they're probably going to go in the state, which is 54 or 55% for Harris, then suddenly you have a very close race, which is going to be decided by a percentage point or two here or there on either end. And what Boozy has said kind of checks out with talking to people. I am hearing that there is a, quote, permission structure, unquote. I hate that permission structure term, but it applies here for Republicans based on not specific endorsements, but the critical mass that has developed of former Bush administration officials, former Romney campaign officials, former Republican elected officials here in Florida, former Republican elected officials in other parts of the country, former Vice President Dick Cheney, that all of this has created a critical mass where there are enough Republicans in Florida, and I've spoken to some of them personally, who don't want to be identified, but I've spoken to them, who say, you know what, this is the time we're crossing over, because we kind of, it's okay. We have the permission. Now, why they didn't have the permission to cross over for Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump, but they do for Harris, voter psychology is a whole nother ball of wax. But the point is, there is something happening. Is it going to be 13% of the vote in Florida? 13% of the Republican turnout in Florida is going to vote for Harris. I don't know about that. I still think that's a really high number that Boozy put out there. But if it is that number, and he says it's based on data he's been made privy to, then, yeah, this race is in the margins in Florida, and the Republicans turning out for Harris could make a huge difference. And if this is happening around the country, then we're talking about Harris winning. And this would track with maybe some of what we saw in Ann Seltzer's last poll out of Iowa. And she's, to me, one of the 3 or 4 best pollsters in the country. Her polls are spot on. Now her poll looks like an outlier, right? But I have a hard time discounting that poll, even though I don't like what I think I've seen in the polling industry the last few years. She's still an old school, really good pollster who gives us raw data instead of waiting and doing all of these things, which is why she's been right. I mean, she kind of indicated to us the Republican trend in 16 and 20 based on her Iowa polls, the Republican trend nationally. Obviously, Biden won in 2020, but by a smaller margin than most of us expected, and did not win Florida, importantly enough, even though the published public polls, mostly had Biden ahead in Florida. So the Seltzer poll, along with this anecdotal evidence I'm picking up, talking to people, the quote permission structure, unquote, being different because of all of the critical mass of Harris endorsements from Republicans and the fact that she's aggressively putting those out there in a way Biden did not. And also Dick Cheney did not endorse Biden. Keep that in mind. There might be something happening here. And if something's happening here, we're going to have an interesting election day in Florida. That's for sure.